You ever wonder where the really big, world-changing ideas come from? Well, turns out they're often not born in some quiet, peaceful library. No, they're usually forged right in the middle of a world on fire. So today, we're going to dive into how the absolute chaos of two massive revolutions gave birth to a brand new science, the science of society itself. Let's get into it. It really all starts here. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, you had these two massive upheavals, one political, the other industrial, that just completely shattered the old way of life. And it left everyone, especially the big thinkers of the day, scrambling to understand a world that just didn't make any sense anymore. So to really get the answers these first sociologists came up with, we have to understand the insane problems they were up against. We need to step right into their world, a world of, and this is no exaggeration, unprecedented, earth-shattering change. I mean, the contrast was just staggering. For centuries, life was pretty predictable. It was defined by tradition, ruled by a monarch, centered on the farm, and guided by religion. And then, suddenly, bam, all of that was ripped away. It was replaced by the chaos of new political ideas, the smoke and steel of industry, and the crowded anonymity of these new, sprawling cities. This wasn't just a minor shift, it was a fundamental disruption of reality itself. And here's a closer look at the fallout. You have the French Revolution, which didn't just get rid of a king. It unleashed what a lot of thinkers at the time saw as total social anarchy, a terrifying breakdown of everything holding society together. At the exact same time, the Industrial Revolution was pulling millions of people off the farms and into factories, creating these huge polluted cities and a brutal new kind of inequality. Factory owners were making fortunes, while their workers, as the sources describe it, were getting painfully low wages. Okay, so in the face of all this chaos and disorder, a new kind of thinker starts to emerge. And you can almost think of them as the first social doctors. They were looking at this sick society and trying to diagnose its illnesses and hopefully find a cure. And they even gave their new practice a name. This French thinker, Auguste Comte, he called it sociology. And his idea? It was totally radical for the time. He asked, what if we could study society with the same scientific rigor that we study physics or biology? What if we could actually discover the laws that govern human behavior just like the laws of nature? And this was his blueprint for how it would work. He argued that all societies evolved through these three stages of thought. First, there's the theological stage, where everything is explained by gods and spirits. Then, you get the metaphysical stage, where it's all about abstract ideas like nature. And finally, the goal, the positive stage, where we rely only on scientific observation and proof. See, for Comte, who was just haunted by the anarchy of the French Revolution, the intellectual chaos was the real root of the social chaos, and he believed that only by reaching this final scientific stage could order ever be restored. Now, this idea of a science of society was picked up by another major player, Emile Durkheim, but he zeroed in on a really crucial question. What is it that actually holds society together? His answer was to study what he called social facts, things like our laws, our institutions, our cultural norms. He argued these aren't just ideas in our heads. No, they are real, external forces, almost like social gravity, that shape and constrain our every move. But, not everyone was buying this lack of order argument. For another group of thinkers, the main problem wasn't just chaos in general. It was something very specific. The brutal, logical system of the new economy, industrial capitalism. Yeah, this new machine of factories, wages, and profit, it didn't just create a ton of wealth. It created a powerful and angry intellectual backlash. To some, this engine of progress looked a whole lot more like an engine of oppression, and it sparked an entirely new battlefield of ideas. And the name for that critique? Socialism. It was a direct punchback at the inequality and exploitation people were seeing everywhere in capitalism. So instead of private owners, socialists said, hey, how about the community as a whole owns and controls the factories and the farms, the means of production? And when you talk about this, you've got to talk about Karl Marx. For him, all this hand-wringing about order completely missed the point. The problem wasn't chaos. The problem was a system that was built from the ground up on the exploitation of one class by another. Marx wasn't just some philosopher in a study. He was an activist who genuinely believed that revolution was the only way out. Okay, so here's his core argument in a nutshell. He called it surplus value. Think of it this way. Marx said a worker might create, say, $100 of value in a day, but they're only paid $50 in wages. So where does that other $50 go? That gap, that unpaid labor, is the surplus value, and it goes straight into the capitalist pocket as profit. For Marx, this wasn't a clever business model. It was theft, baked right into the DNA of the system.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it sets up this massive intellectual showdown. As Marx's radical ideas started spreading, they sparked a powerful counterargument from another German giant of sociology, Max Weber, who had a very, very different diagnosis of the modern world.
All right, let's put these two heavyweights side by side. When it came to what drives society, Marx was all about the economy. It was the engine for everything. But Weber, he said, hold on, ideas, religion, politics, they're just as important. And the problem with capitalism? For Marx, it was exploitation and alienation. For Weber, the bigger threat was something he called rationalization, the danger of getting trapped in an iron cage of cold, impersonal rules and bureaucracy. And that led to totally different predictions. Marx saw a workers' revolution coming, while Weber saw a future dominated by that same cold bureaucracy, a future that wasn't necessarily any more free. So Weber threw a wrench in Marx's argument with a simple question. Why did modern capitalism explode in the West, specifically? He famously argued it wasn't just about money and resources. In his work on Protestantism, he showed how a set of religious ideas, like a moral duty to work hard and live simply, actually created the perfect cultural mindset for capitalism to boom. For Weber, ideas could shape the economy, not just the other way around. Weber saw this creeping rationalization everywhere, even in how we're governed. Long ago, he said, you had traditional authority. A king is the king because, well, his father was the king. Or you might have charismatic authority based on the incredible magnetic personality of a leader. But modern society, he argued, is dominated by rational legal authority, a system of impersonal rules and laws. I mean, think about any time you've had to deal with a big bureaucracy, where you're just a number and the rules are all that matter. That is the efficient but potentially soul-crushing iron cage he was so worried about. So what does all this tell us? After looking at all these clashing ideas, it all boils down to one simple truth. These grand theories weren't just plucked out of thin air. They were deeply, profoundly shaped by the time and place these thinkers were living in. It all comes down to one thing, really. Context is everything. Ultimately, it's like you have these two forces at play. You've got the outer context, the massive societal shifts like the revolutions going on around them. And then you have the inner context, the unique mind, the background, the personal motivations of the individual thinker who's desperately trying to make sense of that world. Social theory is born right where those two things meet. So if you take one thing away from all this, let it be this. Big ideas are almost always a direct response to big problems. The chaos of their time forced these thinkers to basically rethink society from the ground up. They were like the first social architects, trying to draw up new blueprints for a world that just didn't work anymore. And to truly get their blueprints, to get their theories, you absolutely have to understand the world they were trying to rebuild. Which kind of leaves us with a final question for you. I mean, we live in our own turbulent times, right? With our own revolutions in technology, in politics, and culture. So take a second and think. What new ideas, what new theories for understanding society are being forged in the chaos of today?